Welcome to our second topic today, and it is gemstones in antiquity. And the Our main presenter today is Dr. Kray Luxbacher, who is the chair of the Department of Mining and Geological Engineering. It's a department near and dear to my heart because it was my father who originally put the department together some time ago. Uh, so what I'd like to do is initially I'll go through some of the biblical references to gemstones, and then let Kray go ahead and talk about what this all means, and what what some of these gems might actually have been, and also where they might have come from. Um, when you're looking at the Bible, and I'm sure that unless you all had Sunday school teachers that were really interested in gemstones, you probably didn't read these too much. But there's references to gemstones in both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. Uh, Within the Old Testament, the references are in the to the stones in Aaron's shield. You may remember that Aaron was Moses's brother, who was the chief priest of the Israelites, and the description there in the Hebrew Bible is that it said the chest piece is to be of two folds of cloth forming a pouch. Attach it to 4 rows of stones. A red carnelian, which may have been a ruby, a chrysolite, and an emerald shall be the first row. The second row shall be a turquoise, a sapphire, and a white moonstone. The third row shall be a jacinth, an agate, and an amethyst. The fourth row will be an onyx, a beryl, and a jasper, all in gold settings. And the reference here is in Exodus chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. And then there's a similar recitation in Exodus 39. Within the New Testament, you find it in the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, describing 12 layers of inlaid gems in the foundation stones of the vision of a new Jerusalem. And the reference here, which is in Revelation chapter 21, verses 18 through 20, it said, the city itself was pure, transparent gold like glass. The wall was made of jasper and built on 12 layers of foundation stones inlaid with gems. The first layer with jasper, the second with sapphire, the third with chalcedony, and is referred to sometimes as agate, the fourth with emerald, the fifth with sardonyx, the sixth layer with sardis, the seventh with chrysolite, the eighth with beryl, the ninth with topaz, the 10th with chrysoprase, the 11th with jacinth, the 12th with amethyst. And I do have one slide here also that provides a comparison of both of these references, and then a probable translation. And Kay has got a lot to say about what they may have been, and I'm sure you can well imagine the translations from the Hebrew Bible that was probably composed from many oral sources during the Babylonian captivity in the 5th century, before the Common Era. And then in the New Testament, would have been in the 1st century of the Common Era. And so what we think about certain of these gems probably has changed over the years. And so at this point, why don't I'll turn it over to Kray to tell us a little bit about, you know, what her perspective is on some of these stones, uh, and where they may have come from.
Well, I think first of all, I would say it is complicated to try and figure out what those stones likely were for several reasons. I mean, we don't have an artifact. And, so we kind of rely on etymological interpretations of what the scripture said, and especially in the Hebrew, to understand what those stones may have been. And then we can look at geologically what occurred in that area. But we know, for instance, Alexander the Great had these very widespread travels, and so trade was open, and other stones could have been in circulation that didn't occur in that area. In particular, we wouldn't expect to see rubies and sapphires mined in that area during that time, or now for that matter. When I read emeralds, and they're often referred to as carbuncles as well, and carbuncles were also any redstone. So that could be a carnelian, that could be a ruby, that could be a garnet. So that's a bit confusing, but it is likely that there was emerald, because it was very widely mined in Egypt starting in 3500 BC. Queen Cleopatra was a great fan of emeralds, and they were using actually very advanced mining techniques for the time. These were underground mines. They were supporting the roof with pillars of stone, and they would have been very harsh. They were likely manned by slaves and prisoners. But they were using the best technology of the times to mine underground for emeralds, and those mines were open for a couple of thousand years in Egypt. So it's very likely emeralds were in use. Otherwise, it's also likely that in modern times, we decided to substitute out the semi-precious stones like carnelian for more precious stones like rubies, because, in any religion, people want to ascribe more to the glory of God, right? And we've used gemstones throughout the Bible to describe the glory of God. So I think that it's likely that was actually carnelian and not ruby. And it was likely malachite and lapis. We know that lapis was mined in the area and still is mined in Afghanistan, has some of the best lapis in the world. So it's very likely that all the semi-precious stones were present, and that some of the more precious stones like ruby and sapphire were less likely to be present. But emerald was, and emerald is one of our most precious stones.
I've also been interested in looking at some of the historical sources that they talk about the retinue of Alexander's army, for example, talks about being accompanied by stonecutters. And the law, if you will, at the time for any precious stones and metals, for that matter, were all the province of the king. And so, to the extent that any of these gems would be found and cut during that time, it would have been Alexander's choice as to which of his generals he would bestow them on. And I suppose that the generals would then in turn provide them to their wives and girlfriends.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we look at gemstones, their value hasn't changed in terms of how we ascribe their value. So for many people in modern times, they're a way of demonstrating love, of beauty, of reverence in a spiritual way. And some are still, even in some beliefs, ascribed with some sort of magic or spiritual belief. And, we see that interwoven through all the great world religions. And the ancient Egyptians honored the god Sekhmet, or the goddess of war, and they used garnet to honor her. And then we saw there is legend, in rabbinic legend and Christian legend, that King Solomon was given garnet by God, and that he wore it to war, and that garnet would endow the warrior with more prowess, and he would be more likely to be victorious. And so then in later times, we saw Muslim and Christian soldiers going to war and carrying garnet with them. So I think it's very interesting to see how this is woven through world religions and the Bible. And it carries on to some degree today, really, the way that we ascribe power and beauty to gemstones.
Do have a map of the areas where gemstones are mined. And to me, it was interesting to see that on that map, when you look at the Arabian Peninsula, you could only find turquoise there, and I suppose that could either be. Now, was lapis found in the Arabian Peninsula also, or is that further to the north?
Further north, so it's primarily found in Afghanistan. And the Persians, of course, were mining turquoise for many thousands of years, and ascribed a spiritual power to turquoise. And it's known as some of the finest turquoise in the world, with the exception of the turquoise that we find now in Arizona. But if we look at the Sinai Peninsula, that's where much of the mining of emeralds was taking place at the time.
Yeah, and again, the significance here, we mentioned Cleopatra and the other some of the other kings and royalty in Egypt. That the law at the time would certainly have placed those gemstones into the possession and ownership of royalty. What do you think now? The main areas for gemstones that you'd find, would that have been further to the north around the Black Sea and going further west?
Yes, and then much of it would have been mined in other places that we expect Alexander the Great traveled. And I mentioned that rubies and sapphires were not mined in this area at all. But I would see most of them mined to the northwest, yes, or northeast, excuse me, the northeast.
Yeah, well, I think that what we've done is really showed some further incentive for Alexander on his travels or I suppose it's more his conquests, to find those areas that we have on the gemstones. And I think that I mentioned that an important part of the retinue was the stonecutters in Alexander's army. Do we want to say anything about the geologic environment that you'd find for these gemstones? I know you've said something about Egypt. Were a lot of these superficial deposits, or you really have to work to find them?
When we talk about precious gemstones, the ones that have some real clarity, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds, they're typically formed very deep at high pressure and high heat, but they're forced to the surface through some sort of geologic mechanism that involves, flow or movement of magma. That's how they find their way to the surface. Nonetheless, when we look at the emerald mines of Egypt, they were underground mines. Now, they weren't particularly deep compared to mines of today, which might be, anywhere from 5,000 or 500 to 10,000 feet deep for various types of mining. These were probably about 100 feet deep. But there was quite a bit of technology required to go 100 feet deep for several hundred feet, horizontally at that time. So I would expect there would have been some sort of small outcropping or some evidence of emeralds in a stream or a river that would lead people to look in that location for them. When we talk about some of the semi-precious stones, and in particular turquoise, which was so popular in that region, it tends to be a secondary geologic process. So often occurs around copper, which is why we have such beautiful turquoise in Arizona. And it occurs because there's just enough flow of an acidic aqueous solution to generate the right conditions for turquoise to occur, really in fractures of rocks. And the reason that happens in arid regions is because there's not this constant rain flow. So we just need the occasional flow of this aqueous solution to really form turquoise. And that's why you see it in Iran, you see it in Arizona, and it also has to be in the presence of these copper-bearing deposits.
Good. Well, thank you for going through all this with us, Kray. I'm sure that for those of you that want to recheck our sources here, that just look at those references in the book of Exodus and in Revelation. So you can regard this as your Sunday school lesson of the morning. So thank you very much, and Kray, thank you for taking on this task.
Oh, it was my pleasure, John. And I find myself down a rabbit hole. I might keep looking.
Good. Well, I think that when we talk about a lot of these things, everyone should remember that we had a really nice presentation on the gems and minerals that are on display down at the museum downtown. And so I suppose you could take the list of those gems and go down and see some very nice examples.
Absolutely. And that is a world-class display.
All right. Well, thank you again, Kray, and we'll terminate this session. Thank you.
Thank you.